All right. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rails Common Ground, where every Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern, we will feature conversations with social justice practitioners, change makers, and activists on how we can mobilize our daily actions to radically reimagine our democracy. We'll be going up until the election in November, so stay tuned. I'm Malvika Jolly, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between our extra special guests, filmmaker and activist Abigail Disney, and artist and former policy advisor to President Obama, Jodi Archambault. We're also thrilled to have the poet and performer Pamela Snead here with us today, who will read to close today's program. Brooklyn Rail acknowledges the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of this unceded land and waters on which we stand. The Brooklyn Rail also stands in solidarity with the uprisings unfolding across the country following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, and Toyin Salau, among countless others. And in response to generations of structural violence against Black communities, Black Lives Matter, and we will continue to support ongoing action in the struggle for racial justice. When we spoke yesterday, Jodi articulated a question that we felt is at the heart of what we are thinking around the creation of this new series. You said, in the long term, when people are talking about liberation in the United States, what does that mean? What does that mean in the context of mass incarceration? What does that mean in the context of capitalism? What does it mean in the context of police brutality? Before I introduce our illustrious guests, we'd like to begin with a brief moment of silence. And now to briefly introduce today's guests. Abigail Disney is a filmmaker, activist, and the Emmy-winning director of The Armor of Light. As president of the documentary production company Fork Films, she has produced and supported over 100 documentary films. She produced one of my favorites, the groundbreaking Pray the Devil Back to Hell, on the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace, and co-created the subsequent PBS series, Women, War, and Peace. She has her hands in a number of projects on storytelling and social movements. She's the chair and co-founder of Level Forward, a storytelling company focused on systemic change. And she also founded the nonprofit Peace is Loud, very true, and the Daphne Foundation, which supports organizations working for a more equitable, fair, and peaceful New York City. Amen. Jodi Archambault currently serves as strategic advisor at the Bush Foundation and is the director of Indigenous Peoples Initiatives at Wend Collective. Prior to that role, she served as a political appointee under the Obama administration as the special assistant to the president for Native American Affairs for the White House Domestic Policy Council, deputy assistant secretary to the assistant secretary of Indian Affairs at the Department of Interior, and separately as the White House associate director of Intergovernmental Affairs. Jodi served as the executive director of the Native American Training Institute at Bismarck, North Dakota, a nonprofit offering technical assistance and training to tribal, state, and local governments in human service delivery systems. She's also an artist, a dancer, and an activist. So without further ado, Abigail, take it away.
Thanks. And Malvika, if you could do me a favor and send me some chats with time warnings, because I'm actually a little notorious for just losing all track of time. So, and I love talking to you, Jodi, because you just have such a full, interesting life. And I always love talking to people who come from very different places than I come from, because there's always some point of connection. And I think for you and me, it's storytelling and the role that storytelling played in my own childhood, in my family, in my tradition, and what it plays in the tradition you come from. So you're a teacherist, you're an activist, you're an advocate, and you're an artist. It's so interesting. You come from actually a really interesting family of teachers and leaders yourself. Can we just start sort of like, what came first, art or activism? Because they do tend to be like a chicken and egg.
Right. I think in the context of what is art, art can be seen as the vision, as the imaginary space that you can create different hopes, aspirations, realities. They're not bound by physical and logistical situations or circumstances. And I think that's really related to our belief as Lakota people that we start with dreaming. We start our paths having a ceremony around dreaming, and that's really where the stories begin. That's where context and meaning for one's own journey, on this earth, find itself. And so I think the activism is not necessarily a state of being like dreams. Like the art isn't really like activism. It's an integral part, and it's a place. It's a safe medium, a safe process. It's a safe container where people can move towards a certain place of liberation, if that's what your dream is. It is definitely activism is more of just being centered in who you are and standing up and really fighting for who you are.
Well, then that makes my next question really interesting. Tell me about where you started in your youth and growing up. I'm probably like a lot of people my age and a lot of Native Americans. My story is a product of Indian policy in the United States. I was born in Denver, Colorado. Both sets of my grandparents, my grandmothers and my grandpa on both sides lived in Denver, Colorado, on a relocation program where the Bureau of Indian Affairs moved people to the city. So I was born in Denver, and then that's only about 5 hours from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. We moved back to Eagle Butte and Pine Ridge, and that's where I grew up. So I was only in Denver for about 3 or 4 years. And then we went home, and my parents my mom went back to college, and my dad was an educator most of my life in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Education school systems. So that, I was born in 1969. So my childhood is full of what happened in Pine Ridge at Wounded Knee. I don't have any memories of 1972, but that's my family. Like both sides of that fight are my family. So the internal fights that happened in Pine Ridge, I had relatives on my grandma's side who were part of what they called goons, and then I had the American Indian movement side. And I think the influences that my parents really raised us around, being in Denver for some of that period, was around civil rights in the way that America understands it. But we were just fighting to be who we are. Like it wasn't about becoming equal. And that's something that I think is different about Indigenous rights movement, is that we're not trying to get economic equality and prosperity. We fight for Mother Earth, and we fight for who we are. And who we are is very much tied to the health and well-being of the entire planet, not just the human species. So even back then, even from the beginning of first contact, we've been fighting for the rights of water, the rights of earth, and to have more of an understanding of the ecosystems that we impact as human beings. So in the 70s, that the entire, like, my upbringing was around American Indian movement more so than anything else. Sundances, going to ceremonies, and honestly it was kind of scary because we were followed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, followed
followed us. So I thought everybody lived like that. I thought everyone's childhood was filled with paranoia. And that's who I am. I actually was very blessed to be raised on the reservation because of how many people I came into contact with and who shaped who I am today. And the community, the entire way of the way that we exist is richest on the reservation. It's hard. You can do it family by family off, but on at least Pine Ridge, there's a wealth of wisdom keepers and culture bearers. Most of the people in my class spoke our language. That's not the case nowadays, but back then it was pretty rich.
But then you left and went to a very, very different place, right?
Yeah, I went in 9th grade. I ended up at Phillips Academy in Andover during the summertime. So I ended up at a prep school. Somebody just handed, one of my teachers, Misty Brave, my biology teacher, handed me a pamphlet and said, "Do you want to go to school out east?" And I said, sure, and ended up there for 3 summers. And in between was both on the reservation schools, and then my family moved to Bismarck, North Dakota, and I went to a public school, Bismarck High School, for a couple of years, junior and senior year. Then I ended up at Dartmouth, because if you go to a prep school, then they all say you have to go to these Ivy Leagues. And it's not like something that I sought out from a very young age. I just thought like I was part of a cohort that they really pressed us to go to the Ivies. And
was it a good experience for you?
I would say it was a culture shock. I would say that I would much rather have that culture shock. But who wouldn't want to be immersed in elite power pods? You know, everybody from Dartmouth, everybody from Harvard, everybody from Phillips Academy end up working on Wall Street or in DC. So these are places of great elite power. Power builders. And so I would say, yeah, at the time it was hard and it was painful, but it made my transition into Bismarck High School, the local public school, a lot easier. And I understood there's difference and there's degrees of difference from my own Lakota community. And that not all non-Native people are like the ones that I attended school with. There's not everybody in America, non-Native, think of Native Americans in a very dehumanizing way. And Phillips Academy, they were of course really good to me and wanted me to succeed. I didn't feel that from Bismarck.
At Phillips and then Dartmouth, did the people you knew, your peers, did they understand their power? Did they think of themselves as people with power?
I would say no. I would say that we actually used to call it Disney World because it was such a construct of privilege and very little. There were human problems, there were suicides, there were different things, but nobody was really suffering in terms of economically or like how did you get there. That the natives, the athletes, the immigrant community, there was like such a stark difference between the two. There, between our home lives and then going to school. I would say that it is, obviously these are places that are hard to get into, but I would say that the people there really didn't understand their privilege. They're pretty blind to it and hardly knew anything, just like the rest of America, hardly knew anything about Native Americans at all. I mean, just very little. So
what are the most common points of ignorance that if you wish you could sort of wish them away magically, what would they be?
I would say having every single school in the United States teach a curriculum so that I didn't have to be a one-by-one teacher to every person I come into contact with, so that people have a base understanding and a grounding about the human beings and the peoples that existed on this continent before, during, and present times in America, because it's not just about the past and about who used to be in a certain space. It's also about today. It's also about the injustices that continue today. And the basic information isn't there. We've been erased.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly, I mean, that's why you have to teach people one at a time, because it's, it's a whole group of people and a group of issues that's been invisibilized very consciously. And even as there seems to be some kind of surfacing into the public consciousness, then there's this smothering and the invisibilization happens again. It feels to me like very important to the mainstream of American culture not to be able to see you.
Well, I always say that it's off key with the master narrative. It's not quite hitting the right key that we want to tell ourselves about the country, and that land was stolen. There was a lot of swindling. There were a lot of broken promises, broken treaties. There were murders. There was attempted genocide. There were wholesale hunts of Native American people. There were removals. There were kidnappings. There were rapings. There were, like, that's the part of America that people are not really keen on hearing. I mean, it's kind of depressing. Like it's kind of depressing, and it's kind of like finding out your family member is this abuser, and that you're a part of this family unit, and you've been complicit in a lot of those crimes and treaty crimes.
Right. Well, I think on top of it too, there's we've been taught this very specific way of understanding the world that suits itself to the form of capitalism that Americans, insist is the only form. We've been taught that this is the only way to do things. And I think that compartmentalization and what you were talking about, which was you were not fighting for equality, you were fighting for the earth. And in fighting for the earth, you were fighting for yourselves. That understanding of the way the world works is not hospitable to living a life as a capitalist.
Well, I think that the incongruence between value systems has probably is about to reach a tipping point. So we literally cannot treat the earth like it's got infinite resources, even though that's what the capitalist market structure does. We have a limited amount of land, a limited amount of water, and we have only so much we can do with clean air. I mean, if the whole earth is poisoned with toxic chemicals, then we all die. It's just really simple. So the assumption that the presumption that people make about technology solving its way, solving the humans' problems dealing with capitalism is a far-fetched sort of like the aliens will come down and save us someday. That's how I equate the two, because I don't think that that the human species wants to change. The human species as a whole has to change its behavior toward the earth, and there are people that are catching that but the way that has to change is through value systems. The value of accumulation has to change. The value of comparative well-being, like you're only good if you're doing better than your neighbor. That's a false idea put there by capitalism. And so the generosity, like you have to accumulate, and then if you have enough, you can give a little bit. You can give some crumbs to your neighbors that don't have as much as you. Whereas
crumbs.
Yeah, on the contrary, where Indigenous peoples, and I can speak more specifically to the Lakota, is that the generosity comes first, and that mindset of there will always be enough for me if I'm living into the value of generosity. And I'm actually last. I want to give meat to people. I want to give I want to share the whatever kind of bounty or whatever kind of resources that I have at my disposal for people to live. And if you put yourself last, somebody's always going to take care of you. And that understanding of there will always be enough. And it's totally a different mindset than I must accumulate. My value is tied to my bank account or my asset balance sheet.
Yeah, and as a regular garden variety, regular American, educated in a very, very vanilla education system, you know, we were talking young that they're scarce, get yours first. Nobody else will take care of you. I mean, I think they just didn't do us any favors by making us understand the world that way. Do you think COVID is an opportunity to understand that we're living out of sync with the earth and nature? Is there a way to help people understand this?
I seriously think COVID is practice for, I mean, this isn't just, this is my conversations with a lot of elders and people who have been on this earth for a long time. The COVID pandemic isn't the first pandemic that our people have been through as Indigenous peoples. Like the number of Native Americans in North America is about we had a 1 in 10 survival rate. So for every one Native that is alive, there was an exponential power of 10 that, you know, existed before disease. It's a disease and warfare. So the fact that we've been and writers have been talking about this isn't our first apocalypse. Like we remember the apocalypse that happened with contact to our people. And what I think is interesting is that the COVID is something that nobody understands. Like as soon as people make a statement about it, there's 10 other research studies contradicting or questioning what the virus is doing. And it's the design of the virus is really to attack the human species. And the what we're supposed to be doing, like what it's trying to teach us and what it is here doing, is it's making us stay home and be with each other, be in family, be in community, small community, and understand how, I think it showed how fragile our systems are. Like the economy's contracted by up to 30-40% worldwide. The oil that we think we need to consume, we actually don't even need that much oil if we slow ourselves down and become more grounded in place and home. Those are things that give us a chance to travel inward and understand ourselves, and also keep us in place. Like we don't get to travel anymore, so we're having to really ground and grow our roots into place. And place-based living is actually more harmonious, not just because of the carbon, but also because of the way that you feed yourself, the way that you know, if you're not going out to restaurants and you start cooking more, you start thinking about gardening. And that's what's happened across our Indigenous peoples, is a lot of people started gardening. A lot of people started talking about traditional knowledge, about how to feed ourselves, about where the game is, where the berries are. And we all know this, but like the actual practice of it is completely renewed now. And ceremonies have changed. They're different now. We don't get to gather. So then the ceremony becomes more personal and tighter, like, you know, smaller units of just families. And honestly, that kind of resiliency, understanding that this is a chance to build your resiliency, it is really important. And then the other thing I wanted to say about it is that a lot of people have been, even our own people, you know, the mental health stressors around COVID are real. You know, the restrictions and the changes have taken a toll on families, because if you can't go anywhere and you can't socialize, there's pieces of how we renew ourselves that are missing. But at the same time, I think that we're weathering it pretty well. And I think the rest of the population or rest of the world is really trying to understand what it means to, I mean, people were joking in my family, because they're like, Jodi's the only one that's home more. We get to see Jodi more, but we don't have the luxury of traveling all over the place. Like we're impoverished. So the things that have changed for us are very different. And I would say that the resiliency and the appreciation for what we have has always been there. But I think it's taken other people a lot longer to understand what it means to suffer in some way, shape, or form. We're experienced at suffering, and we can do it with humor. We can do it with prayer. We can do it with, and you know, this isn't all doom and gloom for many families. And I think that, like, if people could really take the time, you're not going to get many moments where you get to just be with your family, or you get to just be in a smaller community space. And it is for us. We've got to recognize that this is a sign for us to do some more internal work, basically.
Right. I mean, that's how it's worked out for me, for sure. And, you know, I'm looking with these comments about the dichotomy between technology, capitalism, and the indigenous-based earth stewardship. It's the difference between a line and a circle, because the way we're taught to understand history is that you're always moving forward, and it's like an arrow. But no, we've been limited now to the spaces we're already in. We are now inhabiting circles, whether we want to or not. And there are a lot of people who are making the best of that and learning how to navigate a circle in a way that's incredibly powerful and restorative. And I think it will, I hope, change some people for the better. So you went to work in the Obama administration. And I'm just curious, like, what landed you there, and what was your experience of being inside the federal government? And you started this office, the White House Native American Affairs Council. You referred to yourself as the front door to the White House for Native American people. What's the status of that thing you started under Trump, and, you know, how did it change things?
So I only worked for the Obama administration. I was there for 6 years. The Trump administration does have, I think Tyler Fish is in that position. And that role is in intergovernmental affairs. And most White Houses have had this outreach arm. So I was there for 2 years in the outreach office of intergovernmental affairs. There's also Office of Public Affairs. So we basically sat up, we were the conveners, and we brought people into the front door. We're literally like, come meet with people in the White House. And that's where I organized the first White House Tribal Nations Conference. And that's where the president would come and meet and speak with tribal leaders from across the country. And he did that every single year when he was in office. So I started that and worked in that office for 2 years. I then moved on to an agency where I got some agency experience, and in policy. It was the Indian Affairs, which is above the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but it's basically the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And then I went back to the White House into the Domestic Policy Council. And that was where I worked with all of the agencies on policy initiatives informed by the White House Tribal Nations Conference. So the work that I did was really being an internal advocate and ensuring that the Obama administration followed through with its campaign promises to Native America. And that's really how I got involved in the whole campaign. He was talking about protecting sacred sites. He was talking about Native language revitalization. He was talking about protecting women in violent situations on the reservation. And those things were like, who is this guy? How does he know this stuff that, you know, is in my heart and I know is really important to the healing of our people? Like, what, you know, how many presidential candidates go around talking about sacred sites protection? I mean, that's very nuanced, very specific. Yeah. And so I got involved with the campaign because he was talking about having us at the table at the policy decision-making level, not just at the front door, letting people in. We'd be in the room helping to inform and make decisions on his behalf. So I joined the campaign not being a part of the regular apparatus. I was one of the people who just said, this man's really speaking my language and I'm going to do everything I can to get him elected. That's how I ended up in the White House. I saw, you know, he was picking really great advisors to help inform him on how to talk to us. He was actually talking to us. Most presidential candidates prior to him didn't do much outreach. They'd send surrogates. So the fact that that's how I ended up there. Being in the federal government, I was in there with a lot of people who were also surprised to be there because they always were fighting the government. I would say that the good things about being in that administration is that they welcomed disagreement and dissent. Like it wasn't one of those places where I always think of I used to think of the government agencies as they want the yes men to be in charge because if we all say that everything's fine, then it's fine. And I would dispute some of the things that the agencies would tell the White House and the Office of the President because I had a different lived experience than what they would say. So I saw my role really when I got there, I was like, I'm just going to tell the truth of my lived experience. And they're probably going to send me home and I'll be happy to go home because I'm not here to advance my career in government. I'm here because I love my people and I see this as an opportunity to really move the ball forward.
Well,
and
you just named the very reason why representation is so important. You just encapsulated it there. You brought yourself to the job. You brought everything about your lived experience to the job, which is so rare, especially for groups that feel less empowered. Once you get in the door, you don't want to waste your spot there. So you're unlikely to bring yourself and what you know and your life and your lived experience to it. So it takes a special amount of courage to do that. And if I'm in a room full of powerful people, the best way to be in there is with people who are surprised to be there. Those are the best people to have power.
Yeah, and I think I think there's a difference between representation and people with power. So you can have representatives in window dressing as part of what you do in life. Like you can have people who are Native, who are in the room, but aren't empowered to make the decisions or even to have a voice. So this is internally within an administration. And this was the first president who ever said, we want somebody at the Domestic Policy Council level at the table with those decision makers. And then once you get in there, you're like, oh my God, there's the National Economic Council. We don't have anybody on there. There's Office of Management Budget. We don't have anybody on there. You have to really spend your time building allies and building competence so that people are equipped to help you, make the right decision. Counsel, the White House counsel's office. So these are all things that are part of a bigger strategy because one person certainly isn't going to change 200 years of oppression. I mean, there's a lot of law that's there that needs to be changed, but how can you get as many people on your side and rally the troops and move toward freedom and justice?
Right. Well, I mean, the victory isn't in getting what you want. It's having access to the process by which you can work toward the thing that feels like justice. So you left the Obama administration, went straight back to Standing Rock. Is that right?
I stayed in DC for a year. I became a lobbyist. I mean, I was broke. Like they don't tell you that. Like nobody ever talks about I had a family in DC and was making one of the lowest salaries out of all my peers. That's just how it is at the White House. So, I mean, it's DC. It's one of the most expensive places to live. So that's how the revolving door starts. Like you become in debt and then you end up going to work for
but that speaks so much to who ends up being in these places of power, because you don't hear a lot about it because most of them aren't really suffering that much. They have that little bit extra. They come from families where they can get a little bit of help with their rent and maybe your parents' insurance and all the rest of that. I mean, there's a reason why low-income people don't get or take or keep these jobs.
Right. I mean, I came into the White House at a nonprofit executive director salary in North Dakota at $50,000. I couldn't even eat on $50,000 as a single person in DC. So like that's a kind of different, you know, world. But that's not what, that I became a lobbyist because that, you know, that's where I could sort of get out of debt. And then also it was the law firm Sonosky, Chambers and Sachse that hired me, and they had been my own tribe, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe's legal team. I grew up in Pine Ridge, but I'm enrolled in Standing Rock. But that's been their lawyer since the 1960s. So it isn't, it wasn't like I was going to work for the big evil corp. There are good lobbyists out there who work for, you know, animal rights, and, you know, there's, you know, immigration rights and that kind of thing. So the idea that I was doing something bad for the bad side, it was just basically I was making money.
So when you did go back to
the tribe.
When did you go back to Standing Rock, and what brought you back?
So I moved after a year of working in DC. I had a number of clients. Standing Rock was one of many, and I was on the lobbying team there, and I worked with a wonderful woman who was from her own community, Skokomish, Mary Pavel. And, you know, I moved back to Bismarck, which is where my house was, and I was able to just help my tribe with a couple of, and then I became almost full-time with the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, because that's when they started with the Dakota, trying to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline on the northern side of the reservation.
So can you help us understand? I'm sure a lot of people are familiar, but I don't know if everybody knows kind of the whole of it. What exactly was the conflict, and what did the people there do, and how successful were they?
So basically it was a really long pipeline from the Bakken oil fields down to Indiana, and, you know, an oil hub. And what they wanted to do was ship 600,000 barrels of oil a day through this giant pipeline. And they chose a route that was basically less than a mile north of the tribe's current northern boundary of the reservation. And when you look at the environmental study that came out, they claimed that they consulted with the tribe, and they didn't. They actually came to the tribal council meeting, and the tribe told them that if they came and put the oil pipeline there, that they would have a war on their hands. And none of that was reflected in the first draft EA. And the fact that, like, the tribe was trying to explain to them why it couldn't go there, and basically they just went ahead and routed and made plans to put it there. And so that the tribe was legally asking the courts to stop the project so that they could consider more than what the Army Corps had considered. And what they were asking for was treaty rights, consideration of the land and the water, the animals that live on there, what the impacts are, the people, obviously, you know, it's right above a school. I'm actually about a mile from the pipeline where the pipeline crosses right now. I'm in Cannonball, North Dakota. And this is where my brother lives. This is where I'm building my house. And the spill plan, all of the different technical pieces of the project didn't take into consideration the human lives that are here in Cannonball. And that's what we were fighting. We want it to be considered in the process. The reason that they came here was because in their EA, they determined that there were no people here. Basically, they didn't even have a map of the reservation. It looked like it was a desert. And then they said they couldn't go north of Bismarck because people live there, which 90% of the people in Bismarck are white. So it's not, you can't go there because there's people there. But here, it's not even people with power. They just didn't consider us as people. And that's a trend in the United States. So what we were asking for was a consideration. And ultimately, where I landed, like, in all the time that I spent in government, it's not enough to tell us what people are doing. The United States needs to get the consent of Indigenous peoples. And that's something that is in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's not a practice of the United States right now. They'll just do whatever they want. They're doing it with KXL. They're doing it with some of the pipelines up in the Northwest Coast. They're doing with the LNG terminal in Tacoma. They need to get consent. And that's an international norm. And when I was in the White House and when I was in the government, the standard is consultation. So basically, I'm going to hit you, I'm going to poison your water, I'm going to do whatever I want to you. But consultation, all that does is it requires that I tell you I'm going to do it before I do it. But I can still do it. It doesn't matter what you say. If you say no or not, that doesn't mean anything in the way that the United States processes are in the current state.
I mean, there has never been a time when they weren't living on the might makes right plan, right? I mean, we're big enough, we can do what we want because we can hurt you, seems to be the policy. So how did things resolve, or are they resolved at all? Where do things stand today? There's
still litigation. The Judge Boasberg found that the tribe, he ruled in favor of the tribe. After a couple of years, he ruled in favor of the tribe because what the tribe was saying was that the pipeline is not safe. And the tribe had its own technical experts. The judge also found that the Army Corps didn't consider our treaty rights, so they found in our favor. But in the beginning, like, he could have stopped the pipeline construction. He could have stopped the company putting oil in there, but he never did. And currently, right now, he ordered the company to stop, and the Dakota Access Pipeline appealed and got the judge to put a stay on him stopping the oil. So he could have stopped it way back when, but he didn't. And now he's telling them to stop it. And then they got an appeal to
stop the stopping.
But actually, he did order a full EIS, which is what the tribe had been asking all along. So a full EIS is a much higher standard than an environmental assessment, an EA. So they're still working on the administration, and the company is supposed to go back and do this EIS. That's usually at least a year process. The tribe is asking to be a part of the scoping team for that. This election is really important because how that is implemented, how that judicial decision is implemented, will be everything about who's at the top. Because you saw that the first action that President Trump did was to do a presidential memorandum and force the Army Corps to issue the easement and finish the pipeline. That's the first thing he did on the first day of work. It's the first executive action he took. And he did it on both KXL and Dakota Access Pipeline. And if people don't have any other reason to get out and vote, that should be the number one motivator for at least our people and all of the people who supported us in our fight. Get out and vote for Biden, because at least we're going to have not Trump in there when it comes to the implementation of doing a full EIS.
Right. So Standing Rock, to my mind, was one of the most successful acts of resistance in memory by Native American people, and one of the most successful assertions of the rights and dignity of Native people, even in the face of oil companies. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yes, it is. It was one of the biggest uprisings, and I would say the greatest, most awesome part of how we stood up is that over 300 tribes joined us. The coalition and the backing that we had from other tribal nations was firm and committed. They came, they camped, they prayed, they brought their ceremonies. And with that prayer opened up a whole nother layer of within humanity. I mean, like, people globally supported us. It was, on social media alone that, there were billions of impressions for Standing Rock. The forces, the way the Congress works, there were members of Congress that came out. There were Republican members of Congress who were telling us that they were supportive, but they couldn't come out and support because the pipeline had two major groups that supported it, and one was the Chamber of Commerce, and the other was the unions, the builders' trade unions. And with those are the two strongest Republican and Democrat lobbies out there, and it just squashed any chance we had for legislation. But I will say, Senator Sanders, there were people who were verbally supportive, Senator Warren, I mean, there were lots of senators who made statements, Tom Udall, but Congress would be the only place that we could have had some reprieve legally, if, you know, through Trump. And obviously the Republicans control the Senate, and so that, you know, we didn't really get any kind of relief there. But at the end of the day, the courts did come through. The issue is still alive. There will still be court proceedings. I'm sure that this decision will get appealed. There will be a EIS process. The tribe is still litigating. Probably, I mean, I know they still need funding to continue that legal fight. And the people here are still don't want that pipeline where it is. We still are. Nothing's changed there.
I mean, as a matter of the mainstream American public, I think the actions at Standing Rock changed that set of ideas very fundamentally. I mean, I don't know, you may think I'm wrong about that, but it felt to me like there was a massive shift in the way people understood Native American assertions of sovereignty. And there was an enormous amount of sympathy there that in my lifetime, I haven't seen before.
I agree. And I also think that, I think it was one of the biggest movements in recent history. I think Wounded Knee was up there as well. Wounded Knee didn't have the luxury of social media, which is more, I mean, as with all its pitfalls, it is more democratized. You don't have to go through newsroom editors for a story to break through. But I will say that it pierced what we call, like, you know, our issues fall into a category where the press doesn't want to cover it. I mean, they just won't cover. Even the president, when I worked with President Obama, he would say, we are doing really great work on Native American issues, and nobody will cover it. Yeah. Nobody is talking about it. He would stand up 8 years in a row. He stood up in front of all the tribal leaders in the country, and his entire press pool was there. And how many people know that that's what he was doing in America? Next to none, because the newsroom editors didn't find it newsworthy. And
so why this action, Standing Rock, what was the secret sauce about this that seems to have broken through and dismantled a lot of resistance?
I really think a couple of things happened at that time. One is that it was really youth-led. And so the normal kind of adult rational, you know, we're not going to win, it's the United States coming to abuse us again, that wasn't actually in the minds of the young people. Jocelyn Charger, Bobby Jean, Three Legs, there were, you know, Alice Brown Otter, there were different people who were running to these places, and that courage that they were, that they were expressing brought out courage in our own people and our tribal leaders. And so the movements were building from both the youth perspective, the Dakota Lakota, and then also like the individuals on tribal council and in tribal leadership. My brother was tribal chairman at the time, but it was like, you know, the kids made you want to get up and do something and protect our water. And I think, like, you can have that happen in many different ways in different communities, but I think the part that really opened it up was that's when Facebook Live came online. Because before that, it was just, you know, you would write about stuff on Facebook, but Facebook Live, that put a different kind of exposure on what was happening, because you had people with large platforms like Shailene Woodley. You know, we worked with some producers that I didn't work with them, but the tribe worked with producers, you know, bringing youth voice to the public. Respect Our Water was that, and those were shared among a lot of progressive outlets. And at the same time, I think, like, the tension of the Trump underbelly that was actually building at the time, and a lot of people didn't see it. This was an answer to, this was a progressive answer to the kind of crazy stirring that was happening on the right, because you're like, oh, we kind of forgot about natives, but look at these amazing kids, look at these amazing elders and people standing on principle and authentic voice. Like this, nobody was writing anyone's talking points, and yet we all sounded the same. Like everybody was raised with these values, and it was on those values in a spiritual way. I think like Facebook Live, but in a spiritual way, because this was such a spiritual undertaking for a lot of people, that I think, you know, my faith in having connection to my ancestors, I believe it was time for people to see us again, and to see us not as victims, but as resilient fighters.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly, I think, part of why it spoke to people so strongly. So let's talk about like short-term and long-term going forward. Where do you think are the opportunities for people as activists to make a difference? Obviously, we have a couple of months ahead of us that are going to be rough, and maybe a few months after that too. But you know, we're going to have to. My track coach always said, "Run through the finish line, don't run to the finish line." We're going to have to keep going forward, right? So, where do you think the places are where we need to be thinking about the opportunities?
So I do think that, like, I mean, I want to underscore the point about the election, that my opinion is that the democracy is being threatened by the current administration. And you can pick out different things. I don't watch him very often, but when I do, he's hinting toward maybe canceling the elections, maybe making, you know, canceling mail, vote by mail, canceling this, canceling that. And, you know, with the guise of national security because of the pandemic, you know, there's different ways that it's never been done, but, you know, we can see that he really doesn't follow the law. So, so, you know, what we're dealing with is a really uncertain election. So I think the more that we can get out of the mindset of fear about what he's going to do and get into the active mode of what we can actually do as individuals locally by signing up to be poll workers, by actually going from family. This is for everybody in the community. We can't do door to door, but we can certainly call people and ask them if they need help filling out absentee ballots, if they want to vote for by mail. We can certainly get commitments from people in our families to vote. We know that this election is going to be won if we can get everybody excited to vote. And I know that there are a lot of people here that think like, well, I'm going to vote, so that's enough. It's actually not enough. This time I would say it's not enough. You can't go door to door, so you really have to dig into your personal network and, you know, your hairdresser, like anybody you come into contact with, and become the advocate for voting. Just vote. And that's pretty easy to do, especially because it's not really a message of partisanship. But if we get a bunch of people to vote, then Biden's going to win. This current guy's not going to win.
So there's a question here in the chat box about what sort of recommendations you have for people who still want to rally and support the struggle at Standing Rock. Is there some way they can be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, the tribe still has a website up. I think it's standwithstandingrock.org, and they have a donation link there. There's also, you know, the tribe's telephone number, I think, is in Google, but it's 701-854. It's 7201 is I think that'll take you to the chairman's office. And then I think the other one's 8500, but I could be wrong, so I'm not going to say that one. But in terms of getting out the vote, there are, you know, Standing Rock is there are people who are mobilized here because we had the I would say the anti-Indian voter ID law, because it only affected Native Americans where addresses are in question. And we actually, as a response, the rest of the country needs to look at Standing Rock Native American communities, because what we did was they put a voter ID law in place that made it really hard it caused a lot of confusion. The addresses, we have our own addresses because we're sovereign, but then the post office and the county have a different set of addresses. And if your ID didn't have the right address on it, your ballot could be not counted. And then their address system doesn't work. Like some people had the address of the bar. Like elders were like, this is my address, this is the bar. So there was a lot of confusion, but the tribe sued and they were successful. But even before they were successful, the get out the vote efforts were stronger than ever. So when people tell you that you can't vote, you have to like dig in and make sure that it actually causes the opposite. We can turn this into this, the opposite things happen when you try to make it hard, we come harder. And that's what happened in North Dakota, Turtle Mountains, Spirit Lake, 3 affiliated in here. Like people came out bigger participation numbers than ever before. Yeah. And this is in a midterm election. It was bigger than Obama in 2008. It was pretty high percentage turnout. And so that, that's what we need to do, but everybody should go to vote.org, and that's a really valuable read, because it kind of compiles all the state by state information.
Okay, I've got another question here, which is I'd love to know if Jodi has an idea about how to create more informal cooperation between tribal and non-tribal activism. I know it was contentious at Standing Rock, instances of state violence incited by white protesters losing their cool. And I feel like Kumeyaay have a really particular approach for their right to demonstrate and obstruct the border wall, which was the presence of a lot of non-Native people might jeopardize. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, this is something that's really critical now, because I know there are plenty of white middle-class protesters at Black Lives Matter protests who have been creating a lot of complexity and not always been particularly helpful.
Well, I mean, I do think that just in terms of the nation as they, this is what I always say, is that there's a couple of different ways to be in solidarity, and one of them is to understand where you are. So the Kumeyaay have to be really specific about where their expectations are, and when people come in and stand in solidarity. A good example of that, and I would just point to Mauna Kea, Pua Case, and Pua Case is the matriarch leader who is the spokesperson. There's a lot of traditional leaders involved in that stand against the telescope on Maui, but I think it's Maui, or it's a big island. So the people come in there, and there's really clear rules on how people come in. Like when you come in, these are the people who keep the order. This is the leadership. This is what we ground ourselves. They did a morning gathering and an afternoon gathering, and they kept grounding over and over again on what the principles and why they were there, over and over and over again. No cussing, no alcohol, no drugs. If you're doing any of these things, you will be asked to leave. Like having very clear expectations from the spiritual they had the monarch, the former, not the former, but the dormant Hawaiian Kingdom police there. So there are ways for implementing expectation and controls over a space that are grounded in tradition and in the authority of the people that are there, the tribe or the spiritual leaders. So I think that I'm really excited to see that stand is going up. And if anybody wants to find out more information, if you could share in the chat like where to get more information, a website or phone number, that would be great. And if there's anything I can do to help, feel free to reach out to me. I think it's really important that we continue to support each other in solidarity. And I think this is another example of how Standing Rock has ignited people, and we've been building in Black Lives Matter and Standing Rock and Ferguson and Minneapolis. Like these are all successions of like a helix that's been building for a long time before Standing Rock. It didn't just start with Standing Rock. This is a succession of many different people of color standing up and standing up as human beings and just wanting respect. That's all it is. It's not about fight. It's not about fear. It's about we want to be treated like human beings. And
I love the image of the helix, by the way, which is like, it's the image of the arrow, but in a circle. It's a nice synthesis of the two ways of thinking about the world.
So that, and the other thing is that and I just wanted to mention this, something that's coming up a lot is how do we understand land back, like hashtag, and I know we're over time now, but there's a website talking about land back when it comes to Indigenous peoples. We want to be involved in the conversation around I always say retribution. What is the word?
Reparations.
Reparations. So that I always want to say retribution, but the
totally understandable.
The reparations conversation for us, it's not about money. We want our land, and there's plenty of land that's in the hand of public officials. People get really scared about that, but we are human beings and it was stolen from us. It's really simple. There's a movement of land back that's building, starting out of the Black Hills in South Dakota, and it's on Indian Collective website. So just understanding how to talk about where do Native Americans, where do Indigenous peoples land in the future that we want to dream, and what does that look like? And really for a lot of people that I've talked to, it's it can be money, but we don't want money. We already have won a settlement on the Black Hills. We want the Black Hills.
Yeah. So I'm gonna hand it back to Malvika. And Malvika, I hope you can get, because I know when we go off Zoom, we lose that whole chat. Can you make sure we get access to all these links and all these good thoughts people have here?
Yeah, of course. I can send the links, or I can send the chat log, and then we can also just send, can make up a little document so all of the resources are easily.
Okay, great.
Thank you for bringing that up. This has been incredible. I'm so happy we could end on this topic of sort of retribution, restoration of land. That's something that's so dear to my heart. So thank you both for this illuminating conversation. Our first question comes from our very own Sheila Pepe. Sheila, you should be able to turn on your mic now.
Unmute. Hello, thank you so much. So I was educated as a small child in New Jersey, and we learned that we were learning on the land that we lived on the land of the Lenni Lenape, but it was always put as something in the past, and only as an adult I've understood that many of those people were moved, all the Delaware peoples were moved. Where can we learn about the displacement of all of the peoples along the East Coast? Because I ever thought that most East Coasters think that everybody who was here is now gone, or further north.
Gosh, I just wish I had, I wish I had photographic memory when it comes to resources and people. I do know that there are people that have these questions. There are historic resources, and there are also living people of the Delaware. There's people in Oklahoma. We were just talking in a different discussion about this, and I would start by asking the Indian Center in New York City. They have an Indian Center there. There's also just historic. Whenever I have a question, I always Google it and try to find some books or call a local. I think Yale has done a lot of work on trying to find the way, they must have scholars that and even Native students. I know there are Native students there that have really dug into these questions. But as far as literary works, I'm not as familiar with the Lenape in New York City, so I can't really.
Okay, But
anybody.
that's, yeah, I've done some of that, so that's good. I just wanted to make sure there was something else that I could ask about. Thanks so much.
Sure thing. Sorry, I can't.
No, great.
Thank you both so much. Sheila, we can do some research together. We'll figure this out, because I'm also very curious. Our next question comes from our very own Nick Bennett. Nick, you should be able to.
Yes. Firstly, thank you, Jodi and Abigail. This conversation has been wonderful. My question, Jodi, it kind of goes back to the beginning of the conversation where we were talking about pandemics, and this isn't the first pandemic that Native communities have faced here, and seeing of course how in the news how deeply affected the Navajo Nation was. I'm curious with COVID and this pandemic, and it's likely not to be the last epidemic or pandemic we'll see. Where does it show weaknesses in how the government and how local and federal government is lacking care for Native people and Native families, really?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, a lot of it is this delegated authority that the federal government does to states when it comes to dealing with Native American tribes. So you have two states here, one in South Dakota and one in North Dakota. North Dakota governor has been working very well with the tribes and doing over testing. Like, he's been really a big partner in testing as much as possible. That being said, the South Dakota governor has been fighting with the tribes and having the White House threaten withholding their CARES Act funding because they put up borders on the reservations on highways there to stop people from coming there, to stop outsiders from coming there and spreading COVID, basically. So they're closing their borders and they're protecting themselves, just like the United States did with Europe and China. But because the state of, and really what I say, it comes down to a couple of ranchers and a couple of business people who say they want to use the roads, and so they have every right to use the roads. So they're putting at risk, tens of thousands of people on the reservations because a couple farmers don't want to go around, and that's literally the only people who go through there. You can go through there for commercial purposes, but if you're passing through just because it's a shorter route, then you have to go around. It's a really basic concept. And the South Dakota governor has been very hostile, very contentious, and is making a point of her candidacy for the next governorship as being a really good Indian fighter, which in South Dakota is a thing for the people there, for them, the popularity of the settlers that live there now. That it's super contentious, and they don't respect the tribal sovereignty. But the tribe still has their border patrol and stops. They stop all traffic going in and out of the reservations. So I think the federal response, although they do give funding directly to tribes, there are other types of things that have to go through the state, and that's a crapshoot on how your governor is going to be. The other thing is that the health systems on the reservations, yes, it's been devastating to Navajo. Yes, it's been devastating to our own community here on Standing Rock. We've just lost another elder, and the second elder we lost was a man by the name of Richard Ramsey. He's one of my uncles. He's one of the most fluent speakers that we have on Standing Rock. Before that, this past weekend, we just lost another elder who is a fluent speaker. And both of these both of these elders, these human beings, are, I guess you would say, the most generous with their language gift, and they were really involved in teaching our children how to speak it. And so we have two fluent people that are just massive gaps in our language reacquisition and restoration projects. So like this, how this is working is that it kind of treats everybody the same, like equal treatment for all, when actually, our elders should be getting the best treatment and the best protections available. And like, we should be paying them to stay home. Like, there's a lot of people that were so under-resourced economically, like the elders sometimes, I mean, it's a matter of eating or not eating for their whole extended family if they don't keep working, or if they don't keep organizing things and keeping things going. So, but there's not an accounting for how much our culture is at risk, and how much the government sort of treats everybody like they live in cities with running water. It's pretty, the needs are pretty different, and there's hardly any discussion of that nuance, or they're not even nuances, they're complete different paradigms that don't really, the current policies and decision makers don't really understand and aren't accounting for.
I want to say, I send my sympathies to you and your family and community for the loss of those elders. But we also, it really, I do appreciate that it comes down to voting. And, you know, it's not just the November election, but it's all the other elections, and, you know, locally being aware of those things. So I know we're going to post some links related to that in the chat as well. But thank you.
Great.
Hi, so I've just dropped the links. I just want to say a little bit about this. For this series, we're thinking about having specific take-home actions that we can all as an audience go home and check in with. So this week, we're checking in. How many of us are registered to vote in our states? How many of us have signed up to be poll workers? How many of us have signed up or are planning to vote early and signing up people in our family to get mail-in ballots? So we've dropped a couple links, how to register to vote, state by state. I've done for New York, how to sign up to be an election worker, a poll worker, and we'll continue to drop links with resources and information. But that's the action where no one's perfect, but we're all getting our ducks in line, and we're starting today. So our next question, thank you for abiding with that. Our next question comes from the lovely Maya Bond. Maya, you can turn on your microphone now.
Hi, everyone. I've been doing dishes, so I've been on video mute, but thank you so much for this conversation. My question is largely about the QAnon dilemma and QAnon sphere of this current crisis. I've been curious, I've been learning about Scotty the Kid, who's a Native Save the Children activist and influencer, who's been reappropriating the missing and murdered Indigenous women red hand paint symbol into the QAnon sphere and using it as a symbol for Save the Children, and posting about it on his Instagram as if other people who have painted murals and stuff for missing and murdered Indigenous women have done it for Save the Children. Anyway, my question is, have you seen a rise in QAnon followers amongst the Native communities of which you are a part? And how do you suppose we can handle the rise of this post-truth rhetoric that we're dealing with that seems to have no interest in real life issues?
This is where my age is gonna show, but I actually don't know what QAnon is. Nor do I know who Scotty the Kid is. So I'm more of like En Vogue. I'm not on Twitter, so I'm sorry, but if people are, I mean, I would definitely contact Illuminative and illuminative.org. They and a lot of other people, Jackie Keeler from Pollination would be somebody to bring into the fray, because she's one of my colleagues, or one of my actually I went to college with her, but she really knows, she knows her stuff, and she can get to the bottom of it. Somebody's gonna have to post. Can someone post what it means? I'm gonna go back and be liked.
Maya, will you educate those of us?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm with my partner Ryan, and we were both like, oh, I'm so happy to hear you don't know what QAnon is.
Good
It's a
thing.
good thing. It's a horrifying wormhole. But essentially, I'm gonna also maybe hand this off to you because Ryan's been doing a lot of research into what's happening. But essentially, it's a conspiracy theory that there are children being sex trafficked by people in power in both the Democratic Party, but also just like the media and prominent figures. But the real kicker is that they're being sex trafficked and used as kind of like a blood-sucking vampirous community of people who like gain energy from their blood and from their. I'm gonna hand it off to Ryan now.
So basically, it sounds crazy, and it is crazy, but the reason why we're talking about it is because that it's gained enormous attraction in mainstream media. On August 22nd, there was like 150 different protests around the United States and internationally
that were actually led by Scotty the Kid, who was formerly not a Trump supporter and is now. And the real issue here is also that people like Scotty the Kid, who were otherwise not voting for Trump, are now being swayed by this conspiracy theory into thinking that they have to vote for Trump because he's apparently the only savior.
People that follow QAnon believe that Donald Trump is the only person that can save the world and these children from this sex trafficking scheme.
And this isn't a small thing.
This isn't small. This is like big. This is people. Someone that won the primary in Georgia is a advocate for QAnon. Michael Flynn has pledged to QAnon.
QAnon is a person. So QAnon is his, or I guess they don't have a gender, but this anonymous person who posts on.
They post on like an online platform called 8chan, and it's like little drops of information to kind of give the inside scoop of what's happening behind the scenes.
We're like
okay.
Talking together, but this person like posts in riddles essentially, so they'll be like, on this day something will come out of like the woodwork, and it's like all very like conspiratorial, so it kind of like blend. Anyway, I'll stop, but it's a huge issue, and
I'm not laughing at it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean,
it's just crazy, and it adds to the war on information and the war on truth, and it's just really scary.
Yeah, it's scary. I'm kind of, I think somebody should report that, because I think there's a pretty big backlash for cultural appropriation. I mean, you saw what happened with Dior. And so I think there's a lot of supporters, not just Native, but there's a lot of allies who will go kind of troll places and that kind of thing. So I think it's worth raising, and I'll bring it up to a couple of my colleagues who work in the media.
Can I add, Jodi?
Sure.
Abigail, to what Maya and was talking about these people. I wrote in my editorial at some point, I was quoting Hermann Göring, remember, the second command below Hitler, who was the commander-in-chief of the Air Force, Germany, the Luftwaffe. And this is what he said. He was given an interview just a few days before he took the pill, knowing the day after he'll be hung in the Nuremberg trial. And in the interview, this is what he said. He said, naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy. It is always a simple matter to drag people along, where it is the democracy, whether it is democracy of fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship, voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is to tell them they are being attacked. and denounced the peacemakers for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It worked the same in any country. It's so frightening. So I'm just going to ask one question, Jodi. When you were under Obama administration, were there any talk about potentially having the narrative embedded early on? In other words, I don't know, we're going through the state, time where so much reminiscence of what can be saved, the soul of the nation. I'm thinking of the Great Depression, I just thought how amazing Eleanor Roosevelt was to FDR, how he been inspired to having create the WPA, you remember? And one of the things of WPA was the federal project #1, which had 5 different projects. The Federal Writers Project, Theater Project, Music Project, Art Project for sure, and Historical Record Survey, which I think is very essential. You remember that at all, Abigail? Yeah, I mean, it's so important because, years later when it will abolish, John and Alan Lomax, the 2 brothers who went down the South, who create the field recording for former slaves and folklore, because you talked about dream earlier, remember? And I couldn't help but think of folklore. He's really shown so much the function of dream, an old age function, and it's very common to all mankind, because it's transmitted to orally, and that oral tradition is sort of dying off. My question is that when you were under Obama administration, were there any talk about the text for early children from even kindergarten? Because there's absence of Native American people.
Yeah, I mean,
Chinese.
Yeah.
That's what I meant. I mean, I'm asking whether that had been brought up.
Yeah, it was brought up. I mean, the biggest issue to have that be a federal mandate is that the states have been delegated the authority to determine their own curriculum. And so the fight to get, and that's actually something that Illuminative is working on at illuminatives.org. They're working on with what they call Native Education for All. And it's to try to get, and this is something that everyday citizens can work on. It should be done in conjunction with the tribes in the state, to tell the story so people can understand tribal sovereignty, because it still exists. We're not just still here. We're another level of government within the United States that's not even taught in the civics classes. We have different laws under the United States Constitution that are unique to us and nobody else. It's more like military law. People don't know that. And so it is a state by state. We did discuss this. Another thing we discussed was outlawing or banning racist mascots. That's something that you can do through it's hard to get an outright ban without a law, but you can do policy to lead people to make the right decisions. But the mandate on Native Education for All, it's kind of like why we don't have a national curriculum. We have some things that are mandated, like US history, but how that is taught depends on the state. And some people, things are changing. There needs to be more resources because there haven't been large, wholesale curriculum that's been developed, and it's a big undertaking. There needs to be a clearinghouse for people to access those resources. Even if we got a mandate, we'd have the supply side and the demand side. And then also, just building up the Native education institutions, because what we've been dealing with, where our priorities have lied, has been with the education of our own children, of Native children. So more of an equity issue than it is there is a master narrative out there, and we need better information to equip people with some of the basic things that, I mean, one of the most beautiful stories that I can tell you is, why is the United States federal government the only one that deals with Indian tribes? You have to just look in the Constitution. The Constitution has a provision that says the federal government shall regulate commerce with Indian tribes. Why was that? Why was that there? It's because the states were trying to buy land from Indians before the government was even formed, when there were just 13 colonies. If they didn't have that provision in there, Georgia would be a quarter of the whole lower 48. But Georgia was actively trying to buy land from Indians. Alabama wasn't formed yet. So there were all of these different reasons why. And the reason that they wanted to deal with the tribes was because the tribes had the military upper hand. So they couldn't be fighting the British on this side, the Spanish on this side, and the tribes on this side. So it was better to conduct treaties with them through the new international law. But a lot of people don't understand, like, why is it that the states don't take care of the tribes? Well, the states would have wiped us out, would have tried to buy or steal our land, and they would have wiped us out. The federal government knew that they had to vie with the other superpowers at that time, like Britain, like France, like Spain. So they had, and we were already doing treaties with them. So they had to treat us as nations and do treaties with us that were at least, if not better, than the treaties that we had a choice to do international relations. And the first thing they took from us was our ability to conduct commerce with not just the states, but the other national entities, the other nation states.
Wow, that's so intense. And Jodi.
Thank you so much, Fong, for your question, and Jodi for that answer that was deeply illuminating. I'm going to be a little greedy now and to claim the final question as my own. I hope that's all right, but for me, it is easy to think of Indigenous, First Nations, and Native realities and history in the United States in a colonial context. I feel like that is a comparison and a truth that is easy for me to think, but I wanted to ask you a question about solidarity and what that solidarity might look like when it comes to Black Lives Matter and Indigenous peoples' issues, which are two of the issues that I think are, among others, at the forefront of our current moment in this country. I was wondering, what are the similarities, what are the differences, and if you could sort of speak to movements and actions of solidarity between these two.
So when things happened in Minneapolis and police murdered George Floyd, the thing that was really amazing about that time was that everybody I knew, all, activists, leaders, everybody, we're quiet. We deliberately, and people kept trying to say, hey, doesn't that issue affect you guys? Isn't that something, can't we be saying and Native Americans? I was very careful not to jump in the middle and say, me too. I have the, natives have, trying to get into the conversation, because the way that I see it, what happened at Standing Rock was a lot of people would come into the conversation and take over the microphone and would co-opt the movement to serve their own purposes. And what real solidarity looks like is staying quiet until you're invited up to the podium, until you're invited to talk about the issues that affect your community as well. And I saw so many people in our community just saying Black Lives Matter because that was the moment, and it still is. We have anti-Black policies in this country that have to change. We must stay unified on message, and that leadership has to come from the Black community. When they invite us in, and they have started inviting in colleagues of mine into the conversation, there is a wonderful opportunity for growth and recognition of how the similar social economic disparities ail our communities as well. But it's not about, solidarity isn't a race to the bottom. Like, it isn't about who has worse rates, who has the most suffering, who's been wronged more than anyone. And so this would be, you know, there are disability issues, there are LGBTQ issues, there are issues affecting people from indigenous communities, that whether it's the border in Mexico, whether it's people from Asia, that there's a different kind of discrimination because people don't understand their language, or they assume because they're from Korea, or from Vietnam, that they're going to be this way or that way. And so there's a lot of work that we have to do in understanding discrimination and targeting. But the focus of what's happening in the moment is about anti-Black and hostile policing and law enforcement tactics against the Black community. And that, does that happen in Native American communities? Yes, it does. And does it happen in places like Minneapolis? Yes, it does. There are lots of examples. Does it happen to Latinos? Yes, it does. So what does solidarity mean right now is how the movements can support each other's causes. And I think the land back is one of the ways that people generally aren't going to understand what that means. And land back is kind of like a little bit scary because it sounds like Natives want their land back. And some people will take that to mean, well, I guess my house isn't mine. We're not talking about taking private property from people. We're talking about public lands that are in excess of what the federal government needs. And it's not about like us doing things that would harm people or harm people's understandings of safety and security. It is really about like our sacred places, our sacred stories that tie us to certain places. And it's also about some of the ways that, there are places that were just recently stolen in the past, like just farmers just decide, this is my land now, I'm going to put my fence here, and then it just goes on. And so like land back is the little things, it's the sacred, and it's also understanding that it doesn't mean that we're going to go back in time and make everything the way it was in the 1600s. Like it is, there is plenty of public land out there on or adjacent to or right in the middle of the reservations. We have grasslands here. Why are there grasslands? That's a park. Why are there grasslands on my reservation that take up 20,000 acres? What is that about? Like that, there's questions that we have about the federal government that don't make sense. How we can be supported. We believe that when we heal our relationship with our land, that the rest will come. And it's just a matter of people understanding that that conversation is different than what we're talking about keeping we need to keep our people out of jail too. We need to keep our people safe when they get arrested. When I get put in a cop car for swerving on the road in Lemon, South Dakota, then we don't want that either. But our goal is something that is restorative to our spirit. Solidarity for Black Lives Matter. Like, I don't care who I'm talking to, that is what we need to focus on in this moment. And when we get invited to a conversation, how can that be visionary for everyone in terms of how we move forward? But certainly respectfully, because I've seen it happen over and over again, we need to address mass incarceration. We need to address aggressive policing tactics. They were here at Standing Rock. They were in Ferguson. They're on the Gaza Strip. There's a line and a rationale. Even the press releases look the same in how they characterize the people who are doing basic nonviolent direct action. There's a pattern, and we have to stop it.
Jodi, thank you so much for these incredibly wise comments. To me, it comes down to, anti-colonial and post-colonial reparations, right? We see pushes for these restorations for survivors of, generations of empire all over the world, and there's no reason that we should be thinking of it differently here at home. And I feel like it really comes back to what you said about when people say liberation in the United States, it doesn't begin to exist until we recognize and contest all of these issues. It's not really a scarcity economy. These things all matter.
I think the liberation for all people is inextricably tied to the most basic underpinning of what happened in America during contact. It's inextricably, if we're not free, if you free everybody but natives, then we're not free.
Exactly. I think that's a perfect moment to turn to our lunchtime poet laureate. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending lunch with a poem, and we've been lucky enough to carry that into our community events. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome the poet Pamela Snead to the virtual stage. Pamela Snead is a New York-based poet, writer, performer, and visual artist, author of Funeral Diva out with City Lights in fall 2020, October 20th to be specific, so watch that space. She's also the author of the so aptly titled Imagine Being More Afraid of Freedom Than Slavery, and a selection of many other works. She's been featured in the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, Art Forum, Hyperallergic, and on the cover of New York Magazine. She's performed at the Whitney, Brooklyn Museum, Poetry Project, MCA, the Highline, New Museum, Toronto Biennale, and now here at the Brooklyn Rail before your very eyes, Professor Pamela Snead.
Hi, hi Jodi. Thank you for such an illuminating conversation. And I teach a human rights course at SAIC, and so I'm going to bring some of this information, to the students. So I'm going to read one poem, and it's called "A Tale of Two Pandemics." The headline in yesterday's news blared a tale of two pandemics. Shocking inequities in the healthcare system. What got me was the use of the words shocking and two. Those of us who lived through the 1980s, early 90s AIDS crisis already knew about the existence of two New Yorks, 2, 20, 30, 40, 50 Americas, maybe more, depending on age, race, class, citizenship status. Entirely different systems for those who aren't white, straight, middle class. Those of us who saw our brothers, friends, sisters die at the hands of a system that shunned, refused to treat, threw away the unwanted. Still can't forget a gay friend waiting for Medicaid to treat HIV. He got sicker and sicker. I asked why Medicaid took so long. He said they're waiting to see if I die first. This wasn't the America that I learned about in elementary school. I was instructed to put my hand over my heart and salute. This wasn't the free America we sang of. People who are LGBTQIA already know that there are two Americas. A doctor who kept forcing me to take a pregnancy test, even after I insisted at the time I only have sex with women. I saw his scorn, still a test he made me pay for. And then those women who were forcibly sterilized, had wombs, their life force taken, left dry, barren by doctors who never even stopped to explain, felt entitled to take, scar women's bodies, breasts cut off, no options or consolation given. Women who aren't rich and white already know invisible lines you can't cross with no insurance or Medicaid, forced into black markets for drugs, a land of botched care, botched procedures. Black people already know separate doors, separate entrances, treatments, options, existing long after Jim Crow. And I have kept waiting for this moment, this time of a medical Me Too, when those who suffered from botched procedures and the indignities step out from the shadows, speak, and name the atrocities committed, medical malpractice. I won't blame all doctors, some are good, just middlemen like so many in a broken system doing what they can. And I'm grateful for the good ones in this pandemic risking their own lives, but the image of medical researchers that we see in movies and on television who understand a complex problem, pour through medical books and science journals, stay up all night burning midnight oil to find a cure, who weep with concern, are mostly false, rare like the ones who find cures and refuse to patent or personally profit. Those days have become a myth. What's replaced them are businessmen wanting status amongst peers, entry to country clubs and power, gaslighters, hustlers, actors like Trump. There is a doctor at Mount Sinai, star of his field, charged with drugging and raping patients. No one believed it until it was proven. His victims were only Black women. The rest he left alone. Thank you. And that's A Tale of Two Pandemics, and that's in Funeral Diva coming out. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Pamela Snead. Just hyping. You can pre-order Pamela Snead's Funeral Diva. It's out with City Lights very soon, and it's a memoir about being gay and Black in the shimmering strangeness of a vibrant city on the cusp of the AIDS epidemic, if I'm correct. So thank you so much. And thank you, Abigail. Thank you, Jodi. And thank you all to who came out here today and asked questions and were here in this space with us. Please join us again tomorrow for the New Social Environment, when we will be joined by photographer and friend Catherine Opie in conversation with critic, curator, and writer Lyle Rexer with a poetry reading from Willie Perdomo. That will be, as always, at 1 p.m. Eastern right here in the Zoom. Thank you all for tuning in. You can now activate your microphones if you so desire and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jodi.
Pamela.
Thanks, Jodi.
Abigail.
Thank you so much. That was amazing.
Pamela.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Amazing, Jodi. So inspiring. Thank you for being here today.
Oh, that's a real lesson. It shows us how ignorant we really are.
Love that poem, Pamela. Can't wait to read the rest of them.
Wow.
Thank you for the reading, Pamela.
You're welcome.
This is great. Jodi, I'll be in touch because we need to talk some more, okay?
Okay.
Can't wait. So, you know, reserve for, I guess, a good lunch, no?
Mhm.
Shall we go have lunch?
A real one.
A real lunch? And I write you and we'll talk soon, okay?
Bye, everybody.
Love you guys. Hi, Raymond.
Thanks.
Hello, great
Hi,
program.
Raymond. Hi, Susan.
Hey, Bong.